Hello, welcome to Candlelight, Nonviolence in Dark Times. I'm Rivera's son. When we look around at our world today and our society, many of us are becoming concerned that the regular system of checks and balances, the things that keeps our democracy from sliding too much into the realms of dictatorship, the things that keep our power holders in check and accountable for their actions, we're concerned that those aren't holding up anymore. And what do we do if things like the courts make a ruling and a leader doesn't obey it, doesn't listen to the rule of law, just keeps doing whatever he wants? Well, we have a story today from Pakistan, which is this exact scenario. What do you do when your president won't obey the courts, won't listen to the courts, won't even let them function? In 2007, President Pervez Musharraf was in charge of Pakistan, and he was getting a little bit of annoyed because the Supreme Court Chief Justice Chaudhry, was challenging those abuses of power, trying to hold them in check, trying to hold them accountable to the needs and the will of the people. Well, President Musharraf fired him, kicked him off of the court, just arbitrarily, stripped him of his position. Immediately, lawyers from across the political spectrum set up protests and rallies all over the country, including a picket right outside the Supreme Court. Now, this is incredible because here's a situation where they could have filed a lawsuit, but what was it going to do? It was going to work its way up to the Supreme Court, and then where was their justices that were going to uphold the law, right? So they said, no, we've got to work outside of our usual typical mechanisms. We've got to apply nonviolent people power to this situation. Well, President Musharraf didn't take this lightly. In fact, he retaliated with violent repression, sending a strong police contingency out to use tear gas, batons, mass arrests, and tortures to try to stop the lawyers from demonstrating. But you know what? They didn't give up. And by June, this was maybe 4 months later, the president was forced to reinstate Chaudhry, the Supreme Court justice. However, once Chaudhry started to actually, try to hold the president accountable for his human rights violations, for forced disappearances, for anti-democratic actions, for corruption, things heated up all over again. And a few months later, Chaudhry was supposed to rule on the president's most recent election. Now, Musharraf didn't want this because he thought he would lose. He probably had actually stolen the election. So he just declared a state of emergency. He suspended the Constitution and he ordered all the courts to close. What do you do when your president just shuts down the Congress and the courts? Well, here's what the Pakistanis did. Two-thirds of the senior judges opened their courts in direct defiance of the order. Lawyers showed up to carry on legal business as usual. They said, you can't do this, we're not complying. Well, the president's administration rounded up 25,000 lawyers and judges and put them in jail. Can you imagine such a thing happening? The lawyers mobilized an international campaign of allied lawyers, particularly the American Bar Association and the US and UK governments, to put pressure on Musharraf to release the lawyers, which he ultimately did. But the abuses kept going. Musharraf assassinated his political rival. He refused to put Chaudhry back on the bench. So in May 2008, another 6 months after that had started, the lawyers decided to march from Lahore to the capital of Islamabad, nearly 1,000 miles. They did this with cars, with buses, with trains, with motorcades. They also marched certain sections on foot. They started with 5,000 people. No, sorry, they started with 50,000 people, but in the end they had 500,000 people, all calling for Musharraf's resignation and the reinstatement of judges. Facing impeachment from the Congress and this immense social pressure, the president resigned and new elections were held. But you know what? The lawyers knew they couldn't give up until every single judge was back on the bench. So they held a second Long March motorcade and a mass sit-in to guarantee that their newly elected president would quit delaying all this stuff and carry through on the promises to reinstate those judges. By the time they arrived in Islamabad and they held those mass sit-ins, the pressure was so great that that very night, upon their arrival, all the judges were restored to their positions. The lawyers had prevailed. Remember this story when things get squirrely, when the courts are ignored, when the president doesn't think he's accountable to the rule of law and the rulings of federal judges. We have more tools in our toolbox than just lawsuits and legal rulings. We have the ability to become the fourth part of the system of check and balances, that if there is the courts, and if there is the Congress, and if there is the president, and 2 out of 3 of those fail to hold the president in check, people power, nonviolent action, refusing to go along with life or business as usual, can get the job done and uphold liberty and justice for all. Remember that lawyers have power in the courts and outside of the courts. And if we need to use this story, have it in your back pocket, share it with friends, like lighting the spark of one candle to the next. Make sure you pass this on. I'm Rivera Sun, and this is Candlelight, Nonviolence in Dark Times.